Good morning, Anne. Hi. Hi, Elizabeth. I'm your facilitator. I'm Michelle. I have to wait for the ASA office to give me the authority to get started. And to control what's happening in the session. So I do have your slides. Are you both feeling comfortable that you can show your own slides?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Love to hear that. I do have my backup if you need me to show them. So, but as soon as ASA gives me access, then I'll make you a presenter. So just stand by, okay?
Michelle, you should be, and Elizabeth and Ann both are too.
Okay, you're all set then? Okay, I'm going to put up the intro title slide here. Okay, you should be seeing the screen. You see the slide? Okay. And since we'll wait for Sarah too, but since there's just 3 of you, we don't have to rush. So that's a good thing. Okay. All right, so we can just stand by for a few minutes. Hi, Sarah. I see you're joining us.
Hello, good morning.
How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Okay. I'm making you a presenter.
Okay, perfect.
Sarah, are you comfortable sharing your own slides?
Yes, I am.
Perfect. I do have them on backup and they're ready to roll should something happen, okay? I'm Michelle, by the way, and I'm your
Michelle.
producer facilitator for the morning. So now that all 3 of you are here, just a couple of logistical things. So there's only 3 people in your session, so we don't have to adhere to the strict 15-minute schedule. So you can go as long as 20 minutes, I think, and we'll have some time for questions. I do let attendees know that they can make comments and ask questions in the chat throughout. So I'll monitor the chat, and so when you're finished, if there's something that you can respond to, I'll just read it, and then that can continue after the meeting is over as well. I see my camera's kind of weird lighting, but doesn't matter because I'm the behind the scenes person. Yeah, and so I'll let you go to about 18, 19 minutes, and I'll give you a warning if you're still at it by then, just to let you know about, you got about a minute or so. Did you participate in any of the sessions yesterday?
I attended some, yes.
Yeah. There's not a real lot of engagement, so that's kind of a bummer, but that's the nature of this beast. And we also, we didn't take registration. Everybody who's attending the conference is attending as part of their membership fees. So we don't really have a good sense of how many people, to expect in each session. So don't be disappointed if there's not like 1,000 people here this morning. Everything is being recorded. So if people are making choices, you know, they might be someplace else, but ultimately your session will be part of the public record for the meeting. Okay.
Mhm.
Do you have any questions for me?
I actually do. I've had a couple of friends ask if the video of the session will be available to the public at any point. Is that going to be a thing?
Yeah, we're still working out the details of that. We are, of course, the link is going to be available to all members, but and we have talked about public offerings. I'm not sure if we're choosing. We're still working out the details of that. So it's possible, I would say.
Okay, no worries. It's an interesting year to be doing
I know.
digital conferencing, right?
Yeah, it has been because, you know, I'm at Ohio University and we were supposed to be hosting this year.
Mm.
And so we were getting ready and we've never hosted before and we were like all ready to roll. But we've postponed to 2023 because West Virginia is ready now for next year, West Virginia University. But it's really been amazing how the team that's come together to put this on, and the submissions, we were overwhelmed with the submissions. You know, we didn't know what to expect. And then just the ASA office, Anne and Mary, I mean, Anne has become this expert at teams, and then they also worked with some really talented young people with the putting the poster session together. I don't know if you've looked at any of those, and the web interface. I mean, it's just really been amazing because none of us knew how to do any of this a year ago. So, but it looks like we're pulling it off.
Y'all are doing a beautiful job. Seriously.
Thanks.
I think you gave a good summary of how people have dealt with the last year.
Yep.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
Yeah. So where are you all right now? Where are you, Sarah?
I am in Arlington, Virginia.
Okay.
I'm not from Arlington, Virginia, but that's where I currently live.
Okay. Excellent. And what about you, Elizabeth? Where are you from? Where are you at? Where are you at?
Where are you at?
I am actually at ASA's home in Huntington, West Virginia, so I'm at Marshall.
Oh, okay.
Wonderful.
Sure. I see that. Yeah. And then Anne, you're at Indiana University. Are you in Bloomington?
I am actually not based in Bloomington. I live out in the boonies. Yeah, but it's a really nice day out, like all of a sudden after getting that big snowstorm 2 weeks ago. Today it's sunny, so we'll take it.
Yeah, that's the one good thing about having this morning session is, you know, if you can take your phone and your teams outside and watch the rest of the
That's right.
I was about to say take the rest of the day off, but no, I want you to attend more sessions. I need to get up and close my door.
Where are you all from originally?
Alabama.
Alabama.
I am from Chicago, but I'm also Canadian, so it's
Okay.
a fun mix of accents.
Nice, nice. Elizabeth, you said you're in Huntington. I grew up in Lewis County, Kentucky, which is not very far from Huntington, about an hour west.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah.
So Sarah, you're at Howard University.
Yeah. Mhm.
Oh, okay.
This is my first year there, so I should say I have yet to teach on campus.
Oh my.
But I have a summer class that's going to be hybrid. So I'll get to do a little bit of on-campus teaching. But yeah, I was like, I teach for Howard, not necessarily at Howard.
At Howard, right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I've been at OU. This is 24 years for me at OU, and there's never been anything like it. I'm lucky. I mean, I'm the department chair right now, and I'm in the office. I'm coming in the office, but it's bizarre as heck. I mean, we have this giant building that's still all locked up, but it's looking good for fall. They want 60% of our courses face to face. So we'll see if we can pull that off.
We're doing 100% normal operations this fall,
Really?
with all employees in person as of March 31st.
Oh my.
March 31st. Wow. I did not know that.
That's intense. Okay.
Well, West Virginia's been kicking butt with vaccinations, though.
That's true.
Mhm. Yeah. Not quite all employees who have requested one have gotten theirs. Like I think, one of the last rounds of people.
Yeah.
So, but they've gotten nearly, total 3,000 employees vaccinated. So that's good.
Yeah.
And they're just considering opening up to students right now, which is great.
Yeah, we're not a priority in Ohio. Well, I am now because I'm in the right age group, but university, faculty, and staff, no, we're not on any list.
That's the same in Virginia. I guess we're in the same group as K through 12, like big group, but we're like at the bottom of the subgroups for that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So all the K through 12 teachers, which I kind of get, right, need to be vaccinated before they'll open it up to K through 12. I mean, to higher ed. I'm sorry.
Right. Yeah, they're like 1A and you're 1Z, right?
I think yeah, something like that.
Yeah. This is the last subgroup. Yeah. Yeah. But our governor just opened up yesterday. Anybody over 50.
Oh, good.
So, yeah. So everybody, you don't have to have a pre-existing condition. And of course, my husband's 60 and he was eligible last week, and I'm close to 60, but it's nice to be eligible at least. So, but yeah, I've been reading a lot about West Virginia, and I remember we had a pre-conference meeting probably a month ago, and Mary and Ann, who are, in the ASA office there in Marshall, they were like, well, I'm getting my shot, and Ann just had her second one this week, and I'm like, what? How are you guys getting your shots? It's crazy.
Yeah, 50%, I think like 1,800 people, employees and staff and faculty have gotten fully vaccinated.
That's
here.
great.
Yeah, here at Marshall. We were only at the beginning getting like 100 shots a week. So it was really slow at first, but since they've started increasing the supply, they've been able to get through people more quickly.
Yeah. So how are they doing the rural areas? Do you know anything about that, Elizabeth?
Well, I know that they are doing county health departments, and I know that with Biden's recent expansion to pharmacies and similar, that's going to be really helpful.
Yeah.
For rural areas, because Cabell is, I mean, there's Huntington, and then there's like everything. There's out.
Right.
So yeah, that's how it is for a lot of places. But I'm not sure the exact details.
Yeah, I read something, I think just this week, talking about the possibility of Dollar General getting involved in vaccinations, because you're more likely to be close to a Dollar General in a rural area than a pharmacy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I am across the street from one right now.
Are you? Yeah, that would be amazing. I think it would really be helpful.
I saw one of my friends posted on social media yesterday. She's like, getting a vaccine in an abandoned mall says a whole lot about the state of America, right?
And that's actually next week. That's where I'm getting my vaccine, in an abandoned mall.
Yeah.
It's really weird when they announce that they're opening a site there. I'm like, oh my gosh. Well, at least, I mean, it's a great facility. There's plenty of space, plenty of parking, so we'll see. We'll see. Looks like we're getting a pretty good group. It's 8:56 by my clock, so we're going to get started here in about 4 minutes or so. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I hope that you all had your excellent conference breakfast of stale bagels and really strong scalding coffee, because that's what you need to do, right? And don't forget to have chicken for lunch. Although the conference, if we were having it here at OU, we have some of the best food service. We would have, you're going to be very impressed when you come in 2023. Assuming we make it through this next year. And that's a big question. We've been here since 1804. We're the oldest university in the Northwest Territory. Yep. Founded in 1802 and graduated, I think, our first class in 1804. Little OU trivia for y'all if you haven't been over here. But probably more importantly, our women's and men's basketball teams are doing really well this year. So, sorry about Kentucky. If there's
I
anybody,
started to say, as a Kentucky fan, I'm jealous, but good for y'all.
Yeah, I saw that. It's so weird. I like probably a lot of people just get really engaged during the tournament time, and it's so weird not to see Duke or Kentucky, and I guess North Carolina is still in it, but
I think they're on. They may get in regardless of if they win the ACC tournament, but it's not a sure thing like it usually is for them.
Yeah,
you know?
That's the truth.
It's a weird year for the sort of blue blood schools for sure.
Of course, I'm an Ohio State alum, so far things are looking pretty good for us here
Absolutely.
in Ohio.
Doing great. Yeah.
I hear a blue jay outside my window, welcoming us to the morning. Okay, good morning, everyone. My clock says it's 9 o'clock. I want to welcome you to the first session on Friday. Hopefully you attended some sessions yesterday and you're going to still have some time allotted to enjoy and participate in many of the other sessions and events that are occurring over the next, we still have 3 days. We're only in the second day. So this morning session, I didn't mention my name is Michelle Maroney, and I'm going to facilitate today. The session this morning, we only have 3 presenters, so we can take a breath and not have to rush through the presentations. Like at least in the sessions I facilitated yesterday, I felt bad about cutting people off. But I've allotted about 20 minutes for each presenter, so we're going to try to stick to that schedule. And we'll go in order that you see on the screen. The chat, please use the chat liberally if you have questions or comments while the speaker is speaking, making the presentation, or if you just want to, I agree with this, please do that. We will have some time for some live Q&A. If anybody has something they'd like to ask in person, we'll do the hand raise feature after each presenter. And without further ado, we'll get started. Sarah, I should have asked you how to pronounce your name. I'm going to ask each presenter just to give just a self-introduction, your name and where you're from and that type of thing, because I don't have bios with me. So you should be able to share your screen, Sarah. I just took down the main slide.
Yes,
you can start whenever you're ready.
Okay. So I am Sarah Boiseneau, and I am originally from northeastern Kentucky, near the West Virginia and Ohio borders. Did I just close my is it still sharing?
You want to do it again because we've got a black screen now.
Oh my goodness. I am a Zoom aficionado. I know, but not so. Okay, are you there now?
Yes, we're seeing it now. Mm-hmm.
So I can't see you all now, so just holler if at any point you can't hear me or see my screen or anything like that. Can you all see me?
Yeah, we can see you in the bottom.
Okay, good, because my slides are very minimal. Anyhow, so I'm from northeastern Kentucky. I currently teach for Howard University in Washington, D.C., and my presentation is entitled Emma Bell Miles and the Native Mountaineer. Emma Bell Miles's 1905 The Spirit of the Mountains straddles the line between fiction and anthropological research. Miles scholar Grace Tony Edwards aptly refers to it as a fictionalized ethnography. While Miles often celebrates certain aspects of mountain culture, the author's rhetoric also demonstrates the pervasiveness of a contemporaneous conversation regarding the fitness of Appalachian mountaineers for the modern world. Even those who celebrated Appalachia, as Miles undeniably does, imbued their texts with strains of that denigrating discourse. Miles writes, "The charm and mystery of bygone days broods over the mountain country, the charm of pioneer hardihood, of primitive peace, of the fatalism of ancient peoples, of the rites and legends of aborigines. To one who understands these high solitudes, it is no marvel that the inhabitants should be mystics, dreamers, given to fancies, often absurd, but often wildly sweet." This 1905 description, which is typical of the text as a whole, contains both anachronization and a kind of racialization, which I argue characterized depictions of Southern Appalachian mountaineers at the turn of the last century. And that should inform our notions of sort of racial category formation in Appalachia around that time. This passage that I just read relegates mountaineers to another era through the words pioneer and ancient peoples, and aligns ostensibly white mountaineers with native peoples through the word aborigines. The final line of the passage exemplifies, moreover, Miles's simultaneous denigration and celebration of the region she called her home and the people she called her neighbors and family. Absurd, but sweet. The word native in the title of my presentation gestures at two guiding ideas. It refers simultaneously to Miles's aligning of white Appalachian mountaineers with Native Americans throughout Spirit of the Mountains, and it describes Miles's own fraught position as both insider and outsider. Additionally, though popularly imagined as an entirely white space, Appalachia, in Miles's rendering, is at the very least racially complicated. I'm not sure she intended that to be the case, but it's worth looking at. Miles was born in 1879 and died in 1919, a lifespan, incidentally, nearly coterminous with the years constituting the height of the local color movement. The details of her life exemplify some of the the central concerns of local color writing, among them regional identity, its relationship to national culture, as well as the interactions between insiders and outsiders in cultural exchanges. In his introduction to Spirit of the Mountains, Appalachian studies scholar David Wisnett argues, "The central fact of Emma Bell Miles's life and the predominant theme of her book is ambivalence and biculturalism." We can further characterize Miles's implicit attitude toward the literary exploitation of America's backwaters as ambivalent and bicultural as well. Miles, born Emma Bell, was born in Evansville, Indiana, while her parents were visiting there. The family then resided in Rabbit Hash in northern Kentucky, and they eventually settled in a small town outside of Chattanooga, Tennessee when she was 11. Miles occupied the insider-outsider position so common to the narrators of regionalist literature during this period. In her biography of Miles, Kay Baker Gaston characterizes the Bell family as a sort of middle class that was neither of the town nor of the mountain. To some degree, they may have served as a bridge between the summer people and the mountain people, while they belonged to neither group. Miles references these and other class divisions in her personal journals, writing on October 28, 1908, which you see on the screen here. "There are but two classes of people in the mountains, those who are in constant dread of being caught by the nip of winter without cornmeal or meal, and those who are not. The former are likely to be in the habit of frantically chopping wood as the snow begins to fly. The latter spend the snowy weather in mending harness and half-soling the children's shoes." Such liminality and uncertainty characterized Miles's life, writing, and her role in developing popular conceptions of mountaineers and their place, or perhaps lack thereof, in the modern world. Critical attention to Miles's work has been relatively scant. Elizabeth Englehart, in focusing on Miles's Spirit of the Mountains, considers Miles's writing an early form of ecological feminism, using the local color genre to criticize both local color stereotypes and early feminist benevolent work while being able to reach the broadest audience possible. I wish to complicate the notion that Spirit is largely oppositional to emerging mountaineer stereotypes, as Englehart suggests, even as I acknowledge the ways in which Miles's text does seek to defend the mountaineer from such degradation. This is not to deny the legitimacy of Englehart's reading of Miles's developing a proto-ecological feminism. This progressive cultural work, however, does not diminish the fact that Miles' text participates in the rhetoric of an emerging hillbilly discourse surrounding the mountaineer, even as it attempts to resist that very discourse. As working class studies scholar David Roediger argues, despite the spread of the critical study of whiteness, there is still too little awareness beyond and within academia that the 19th century ended with predictions that the United States was about to lose its racial moorings. I read Miles's Spirit of the Mountains with an awareness of this turn of the century racialized narrative of authentic and specifically white Americanness, which served to distinguish supposedly real Americans from what Roediger calls new immigrants, who arrived in the late 19th century primarily from Eastern and Southern Europe. The mountaineer, whose image was just emerging in the pages of elite periodicals, occupied a fraught position in this evolving sociocultural milieu, depicted at times, to borrow sociologist Matt Ray's phrase, as not quite white. The Spirit of the Mountains was published in 1905 by James Pott and Company and includes a reprint of the essay Some Real American Music, which was originally published in Harper's in June 1904, and that'll become important in a minute. While Spirit itself saw limited circulation, the high-profile publishing of the aforementioned essay lends credence to the idea that through her work, Miles participated in a national conversation about the mountaineer. Thus, this relatively obscure publication, which you have a cover of on the slide here, has something to tell us about the formulation of now familiar stereotypes inextricably linked to evolving racial hierarchies that emerged simultaneously with the increasing profitability of mountain land and labor. In Spirit's first chapter, The Log Church School, Miles's narrator, a young outsider teacher, introduces her mountaineer subjects to the reader with alternating tones of distance and sameness. And scholars have determined that Miles is not the unnamed narrator of Spirit because her narrator is a school teacher and Miles never taught in the mountains. However, it is difficult to separate author from narrator in this genre blending work that straddles the line between fiction and nonfiction. As Englehart aptly explains in her foreword to Miles's compiled journals, Miles is not its narrator, but maybe its voice. Miles's inability to decide if she is an observer of mountaineers or a mountaineer herself permeates the entire text and is likely responsible for the ambivalence the narrator exhibits regarding mountaineer stereotypes. For example, in the first chapter, the narrator characterizes the pupils of the school in animalistic terms, implicitly distancing herself from them. She writes, "Most of the children hereabout run free as the fawns and cubs that they often capture for playmates, as timid, as lithe, and about as intellectual." However, a mere 3 pages later, Miles' narrator lauds, quote, native mountain learning as perhaps at least as valuable as formal education, writing, "If the young minds wander afield with the scampering and flitting of the little brothers of treetop and burrow, what matter? Perhaps they learn at such times something not to be found between the covers of Webster." In short, the narrator's mountain pupils are simultaneously wild creatures with subhuman intellect and possessors of knowledge superior to anything to be found in books. The narrator's generally approbatory stance toward all things natural owes in part to Miles's own love of the natural world. In her biography of the author, Gaston characterizes Miles' chief connection to the mountains as being with nature itself. To look for her, Gaston writes, you must go to the woods, the only place she was ever truly at home. Additionally, Spirit's emphasis on nature may also have served to characterize the mountaineer as an anti-modern figure, clinging to the land and resisting the forces of industrialization. Most importantly, the narrator's waffling between counting herself among her mountaineer subjects and maintaining an observational distance, and even critical, denigrating distance, may owe to Miles's affinity for the natural surroundings of the mountains, even as she disdained the behaviors of some of the residents. Similarly, in Chapter 2, Cabin Homes, the narrator at once describes mountaineers in ways consistent with emerging national stereotypes, even as she counts herself among this increasingly maligned population. Civilization is not likely to soon remedy this evil, and she's talking here about the prevalence of poor health in this area. She writes, since it substitutes drugged whiskey for their own moonshine and badly compounded plugs for their own homegrown script tobacco, cheap baking powders and salicylic acid for canning fruit. Miles characterizes encroaching modernization as exacerbating mountain woes rather than remedying them. And while her descriptions of mountaineers drinking moonshine and chewing tobacco are certainly consistent with their emerging stereotype, in the first sentence of the next paragraph, the narrator inserts herself among them in second person plural voice. Yet, though we violate every rule of hygiene, we are a strong people, sound of wind and limb, making light of hardship and heavy labor. Nonetheless, Miles's narrator, and perhaps Miles herself, is unable to characterize the mountaineer without stereotype. We violate every rule of hygiene, even when including herself. Chapter 5, The Savage Strain, is where Miles makes her implicit case for an affinity between the Kentucky and Tennessee mountaineer and that of the vanishing Indian, a 19th century trope and rhetorical move that anachronizes and racializes mountaineers, even if that effect was unintentional. And I'm just still not sure if Miles was consciously participating in that trope, but it's there nonetheless. Miles's application of the vanishing Indian trope to the Appalachian mountaineer draws on an established rhetorical device delineated by scholars such as Brian Dippy and Laura Romero. This rhetorical tradition should form the theoretical backdrop for understanding the significance of Miles's aligning white mountaineers with Native American peoples. Dippy argues of the rhetoric of doom that surrounded Native Americans in the 19th century, quote, to make their case, poets, novelists, and essayists adopted a stylistic strategy that summed up Indian fate in images drawn from nature. The Indian was at the sunset of his existence. In aligning the white Appalachian mountaineer with both Native Americans and with mountaineers' natural surroundings, Miles places her best-known work within this rhetorical lineage of supposedly vanishing peoples. While I do not believe that Miles's intent was malicious, she undeniably participates in the fashioning of a mountaineer who both belongs to another period and is racially other. Miles implicitly attributes many of the mountaineer's peculiarities, she calls them qualities and traditions, the cause of which is farther to seek, to an underlying strain of Native American influence, whether through actual miscegenation in the not too distant past or simply cultural contact. The bearing of the mountaineer, she writes, is dignified, and you have this quote on your screen here, dignified rather than stolid. Distinct alike from the homely shrewdness of the New Englander, the picturesque freedom of the man from the New West, and the elaborate courtesy of the South proper. Does it not bring to mind a vision of moccasined feet and the grave laconic speech of chiefs met together for high powwow? Of course, we might read this passage as merely a comment on what Miles perceives as the mountaineer's proud carriage, and certainly such an image is part of Miles's aim. However, she simultaneously defends mountaineers against popular conceptions of their undignified character, as she paradoxically furthers the rhetoric of a vanishing mountaineer, a racialized other who, to use William Goodell Frost's famous formulation, will, quote, give place to foreigners and melt away like so many Indians if he cannot properly modernize. Throughout this chapter, Miles furthers her alignment of the mountaineer with the vanishing Indian, such as when the narrator describes a young man who chews his tobacco with as much dignity as a young brave in his first war paint. Indian-like, too, she tells us, is the mountaineer's stoic acceptance of privation and hardship, and the sardonic quality of his humor. From the Cherokee, she writes, the mountaineer has acquired his knowledge of herbs and medicine, and a certain Pap Ferris's account of his knowledge of a secret cold water spring savored of aboriginal custom. Miles even ends the chapter by saying, sometimes one may suspect an aroma of Cherokee magic haunting them all, which suggests that the mountaineer's essentialized different from normative white readers, these would be Miles's readers, might be accounted for by, at the very least, Native American influence on mountaineer folkways, and perhaps even through miscegenation among Cherokee and white mountaineers. Further, and allaying doubt that Spirit's narrator is mostly a proxy for Miles, we see in Miles's journals a direct claim of miscegenation between the typical Tennessee mountaineer as having the ancestry of the Scots-Irish and also the early association with the Cherokee, which have given an indwelling look, a mystical brooding, dreaming. In short, Miles explains mountaineer difference by racializing it. Miles is characterizing the white mountaineer as primitive, and especially her animalistic descriptions of her subjects are also similar to contemporaneous racist descriptions of African Americans that appeared in the same pages of the periodicals in which her works appeared. Indeed, in the same 1904 issue of Harper's, in which Some Real American Music appeared, a Civil War short story entitled The Non-Combatants by Robert Chambers describes an African American enslaved person, Moses, in the animalistic and primitive terms that resonate in Miles's text. For example, Moses descended the steps stiffly and teetered through the shrubbery with the instinct of a watchdog worn out in service. Printed in the same issue as Miles's essay, this description calls to mind Miles's earlier cited description of Spirit's narrator's mountain pupils as running free as the fawns and cubs that they capture for playmates, as timid, as lithe, and about as intellectual. Miles also accounts for one mountaineer behavior, at least in part, through mountaineers' affinity with supposed Native American superstitions. It is scarcely too much to say that every man and woman in the mountains is, in one way or another, superstitious. From the old Irish, it is likely, or else from the Cherokee, or from the grimly mystical minds of the earliest Indian fighting pioneers. And finally, of course, such leaps from stereotypes to perceived reality and back are common to the human desire to categorize. And for precisely this reason, representation is immeasurably important in shaping national conceptions of a particular group. As Ray explains, Matt Ray from Not Quite White, we tend to rely heavily on stereotypes because to do otherwise requires a significant amount of cognitive work. Instead, relying on our shared representations, we treat category as if it were fixed, a naturally given thing, and then assume the person we are fitting into the category shared some or all of the traits and characteristics of the category. In short, we reify categories into identities. Even as Spirit's narrator sometimes counts herself among her subjects, she reifies and provides further evidence for the emerging hillbilly stereotype that is still readily identifiable in popular media over 100 years later. Such discourse surrounding mountain whites, and in some instances rural whites more generally, developed at a time when eugenics was gaining popularity in the United States. And I think that's important for thinking through how this kind of fed into her depictions. And within this context, we can see that even fictional representations had the power to perpetuate and bolster such notions about the supposed inherent deficiencies of mountaineers. So through this presentation, I hope to have contributed to complicating our notions of race, and especially of race formation in Appalachia, through interrogating the vexed racial status of Miles's ostensibly white mountaineers.
Thank you, Sarah. There is a couple of questions from the same audience member in the chat. Lisa DeSavino, I hope I'm pronouncing that, or Liza DeSavino. Liza is asking, could you speak a bit about the music and songs included in Belle's book and how she presented it? And then she does have Liza does have a follow-up question as well.
So if I'm thinking about that essay, the Summer Real American Music, she talks about Dvorak, and there's some interesting, I'm having a hard time remembering off the top of my head, but some interesting treatment of like his ethnic background and the status of, let's see, I don't, unfortunately, I don't have those excerpts in front of me, but I suppose now I'm having a hard time remembering that chapter. Do you have Liza, do you have a question about or do you have specific music in mind? Because I'm unsure if you're talking about the mountain music she talks about, or her description.
She's typing, Liza is typing a
Okay.
spot. Yes, the mountain music is what Liza is saying.
The mountain music, right? So I would say that she views, that's sort of the paradox of Miles's portraiture of Appalachian mountaineers, is that they are both, she calls them peculiarly American in that their music is innovative and American in its form. Though that's debatable, I guess, in terms of real actual musicology. But at the same time as she's characterizing them as these kind of others.
So
And-
Liza does have a couple of other questions, and I'm going to ask you if you would just respond in the chat, Sarah, so we
Yes,
can
I'm
move
sorry,
on to
I'm
the next.
sorry.
Yeah, and then I need you to stop sharing your screen.
Oh, I thought I did. I'm so sorry.
That's all right. No problem.
There we go. Sorry about that.
No problem at all. So yeah, so Liza and Sarah will jump over into the chat and you can continue your conversation there. And then we're going to move on to our second presenter. And again, I should ask you how you say your last name. Mahadi, is that correct? Or all right.
You got it on the first try.
All
Thank
right.
you.
So, Anne, will you put your slide up, because there was it looked like there was a little gray box on Sarah's slide. I had that problem yesterday. I just want to make sure you're sharing the right screen. Sarah, it didn't interfere at all with your presentation.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, it was fine.
Let me just make sure that this is working. Can you see everything?
Yeah, that looks just fine, actually. If you're going to start the slideshow, let's make sure that it's perfect. Yep, that looks fine. Okay, Sarah, I'll let you self-introduce and then take it away whenever you're ready.
Great. Thank you so much. It's a privilege to be here today. My name is Anne Mahady, and I'm a PhD candidate at Indiana University in African American and African Diaspora Studies. I study African American artists who mobilize folklore to counter fascism and Jim Crow in the United States. And that gets to my presentation today, which is entitled On Common Ground, the Infrapolitics of Palmer Hayden's John Henry series. Between 1940 and 1947, African American painter Palmer C. Hayden created what would become his masterwork, a 12-panel narrative cycle on the life of Appalachian folk hero John Henry. And throughout my presentation today, I use the term Appalachian, coined by Appalachian poet Frank X. Walker, to refer to African Americans living in and identifying with Appalachia. While previous scholars understand this series as Hayden's formulation of John Henry as both racial icon and universal symbol of labor struggle, today I re-examine the series as a recuperative project about Appalachian identity and culture. Hayden's vision of Appalachia centered Appalachians within a multiracial body politic, a counter to pervasive narratives about the region as white space. The series was part of a larger political project for Hayden that inserted what James C. Scott and Robin D.G. Kelly term the hidden transcripts of protest into the public transcript of Appalachian history. Hayden traversed the color line in multiple manners that may be understood through the lens of infrapolitics or expressions of a dissident Black Southern working class politics. In this presentation, I contend that the John Henry series registered the artist's resistance to Jim Crow on canvas, on the road, and across the color line. A prominent painter of the Harlem Renaissance during the 1920s and of the WPA throughout the 1930s, Palmer Hayden was best known for his marine scenes and for the still life that you see on screen at right, Fétiche et Fleur. The 1940s, though, marked a period of sea change in Hayden's career, in which he began producing stunning images of Black Southern life that drew from his personal memories, observations, and folklore research. Frustrated with the restrictive schedule and creative constraints placed upon artists in the WPA, Hayden resigned from his position in the easel division to immediately begin work on the John Henry series. In 1939, Hayden shared his plans and research for a multi-panel series on the Ballad of John Henry with his close friends, the Kentucky painters Buford and Joseph Delaney, who you'll actually see here in these photographs. Hayden and Joseph Delaney, who is seen at left in one of the photos, in particular bonded over their experiences as Black Southern artists who worked blue-collar jobs across Appalachia and the Tidewater region. Hayden working as a roustabout, and Delaney as a railroad worker. Although future art historians would interpret Hayden's version of John Henry as a universal labor hero, Joseph Delaney appreciated the specificity of Hayden's imagery to their shared experiences working in northern Appalachia, saying, quote, "Palmer and I are no strangers to a 20-pound hammer whooping that steel." On canvas, the series made Appalachian history plain for all to see. Hayden's interpretation of the ballad drew from West Virginia University folklorist Lewis Chappell's account of the John Henry legend, which situated his story in Talcott, West Virginia, at the worksite for the Big Bend Tunnel. Hayden's was the only series in the 20th century to include Appalachian site-specific details, such as the view of the Greenbrier River, the blue-green cast of the hills behind it, and even the multifaceted texture and shape of the rock in the surrounding area. A story told in 12 individual panels, Hayden's John Henry series traces the hero's life from his childhood prophecy that the railroad would be his undoing, seen at the upper left, to the famed contest in which he beat a steam drill at laying track and then expired from his efforts. Yet, while the series maintains the core tension between man and machine from the original narrative, Hayden devotes more compositional space to the everyday activities of Appalachian workers than to the climactic contest itself. Rendered in painstaking detail and brilliant chroma, Hayden's visual interpretation of the ballad highlights region-specific labor practices to locate traces of Appalachian labor resistance. The first image that I examined today centers on erasure and reclamation. His hammer in the wind underscores the agentive aspect of John Henry's story in a vignette where the hero reclaims Appalachian laborers' work from an act of erasure by a white site boss. As we gaze past the edges of the composition, we see Black workers drilling into the rock in the early stages of tunnel construction. Hayden furnishes a detailed visual account of the racialized division of labor there. We can see that white workers have been placed in supervisory roles, while Appalachian tunnel laborers carried out the most physically challenging work, chiseling, hammering, and wheeling out rock. A white site captain in a stovepipe hat pauses at the side of the composition, so struck by the pace of the Appalachian crew's work that, according to the ballad, he attributed their progress on the tunnel to an act of nature, a gust of wind. John Henry refuses this explanation and reclaims their progress as the product of their hard work, saying, "Oh Lord, that's my hammer you hear in the wind." The playful, almost evasive delivery of this line in the song is consistent with what we know about the tactics used by Black laborers in Virginia and West Virginia to make themselves heard. As Robin D.G. Kelly notes, Black workers in the West Virginia mining and railroad industries often gave the appearance of accommodation to ensure their job security and personal safety. Hayden's literary counterpart, Zora Neale Hurston, recorded a similar tactic in Mules and Men, writing, quote, "The white man is always trying to know into somebody else's business. I'll put this play to in his hand and he will seize it and go away. Then I'll say my say and sing my song." Hayden's John Henry and his work team smile, even as the folk hero refuses the erasure of their labor by the white site boss. The scene speaks to a larger reality in which Black workers' contributions were dismissed and deliberately overlooked because they were assigned the most back-breaking manual labor. Thus, John Henry's reclaiming the product of their labor, the tunnel itself, pushes back at the white supremacist conceptualization of Appalachian workers as unproductive and disposable. The next scene, "Where'd You Get Them High-Top Shoes," is named for a lyrical exchange from the ballad that the artist reimagines as an outdoor hoedown. Within a sea of faces, Black, white, and Indigenous Appalachians are gathered in one space for leisure and socializing. This vision of an interracial leisure space could possibly be misread as an overly romanticized image of race relations in West Virginia. However, as historical records from the C&O line suggest, railroad work sites in the Appalachian regions of West Virginia and Kentucky were integrated, and hoedowns often drew a similar crowd of observers. Thus, Hayden's depiction of an outdoor dance with a multiracial crowd is consistent with the history of this region, as gleaned from accounts by historians Carter G. Woodson, William H. Turner, and Phil Jameson. Additionally, the scene and indeed the rest of the series itself countered the erasure of multiracial Appalachians and the taboo history of interracial relationships. Hayden consciously chose never to show John Henry and his love interest, the auburn-haired Polly Ann, seen here in the center playing the banjo, in direct contact. However, one of the final panels in the series contains a scene of Polly Ann holding hands with John Henry and her daughter as they walk toward the site of his death. A reminder that multiracial people were integral to the history of Appalachia, as they were to American history and identity. Hayden's series offered a visual counter to the whitewashing of Appalachia, particularly pushing back against the erasure of Afro-Latins from the popular image of the region created by federal arts programming. In his interviews, Hayden was emphatic that he created the series to underscore the importance of Black labor in America, particularly focusing on the period of industrialization in the postbellum South. Yet the series also appears to have been a response to whitewashing of railroad history, which his diary shows he encountered at the railroad building for the 1939 World's Fair. The building featured a large theatrical program called Railroads on Parade that presented a heavily romanticized narrative of American railroad history, which did not include African Americans as part of the history of railroad construction, but rather as the beneficiaries of white benevolence via vignettes about the morning train for President Abraham Lincoln and the Pullman porters. Likewise, New Deal public arts projects placed African Americans in marginal roles, or, as in the case of West Virginia, erased them from the public transcript of regional history almost entirely. Of the 11 public murals and sculptures celebrating West Virginia mine and railroad labor in post offices and other public buildings, none featured African Americans at all. With these erasures from the official transcript of American history in mind, it's no wonder that Hayden emphasized the recuperative nature of his artistic career in interviews, saying, quote, "I paint what us Negroes, us colored people, us Americans know. I do like to paint what we did." Because so little of Hayden's career after the Harlem Renaissance is known and so few of his works are understood, my dissertation research has centered on reconstructing his life history and politics using archival documents and family narratives. Although Hayden traveled to West Virginia on multiple occasions, his first journey in 1940 was the only one documented in substantial detail. Hayden's first journey together in Appalachia was as a married couple on their honeymoon, traveling through areas where their marriage was considered illegal. Palmer Hayden is seen here at left in a photograph taken by his wife, Mimi. Mimi was a white school teacher from Iowa, and she was also his muse and is featured in many of his photographs in his personal archive. While examining Hayden's Appalachian travel diaries and sketches from the archives of American art, it became abundantly clear that his first sojourn into Appalachia was meticulously planned, down to the gas mileage for each driving stint. I cross-checked all of the sites where the Haydens stopped in Virginia and West Virginia and Pennsylvania with data from the 1940 Negro Motorist Green Book as recorded in public pages for ArcGIS. This process revealed that Hayden had navigated using the Green Book to locate lodgings, and when he could not, he and his wife camped in state parks, such as Hawks Nest State Park. In conversation with Mimi Hayden's niece, Dorothy Nelson, I learned additional details. Hayden himself had not driven, as he did not yet have his driver's license. He had taken public transportation for most of his life. I also learned that the couple stayed on Native American reservations at least once during this journey, which I'm still seeking to document. And in addition, when the Haydens stayed at hotels, they often checked into separate rooms to ensure their personal safety. Hayden's overarching political project was about the recuperation and preservation of the Black past, an aim that required travel to sites for the preparation of sketches, speaking with academics, conducting folkloric research, and his personal observations of the communities he would portray on canvas. In this manner, his work is comparable to that of other foundational African-American experimental folklorists of his generation. And Elaine Locke actually mentioned Hayden as a comparable figure to the writers Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes, a fact which we'll come back to in a second, both of whom used their research and memory work to chronicle African diaspora folklore throughout the 1930s and 1940s. While his contemporaries did notable work at historically Black research sites, Hayden extended this research to sites that were less frequently explored due to the threat of Jim Crow violence. That the Haydens undertook this complicated and difficult journey together to document a critical moment in Appalachian history suggests that they believed Black Southern folklore was inherently worth the risk to preserve. Put more directly, it's a miracle that the Haydens undertook this journey, little less survived it. While Hayden chronicled and engaged in everyday acts of resistance to Jim Crow, he also participated in more formal activist organizations advocating for multiracial democracy. The John Henry years spanned the height of his participation in the Common Council for American Unity, or the CCAU, a leftist organization centered on working against fascism abroad and Jim Crow at home. Founded by Louis Adamick in 1939, the organization mobilized the arts to advocate for the full inclusion of immigrants and people of color within American democracy. CCAU members participated in cross-cultural artistic exchanges, which shaped the trajectories of their careers by encouraging solidarity across racial and cultural lines. Hayden was part of a core group of artists and writers who participated in the CCAU's programming, such as public art exhibitions, poetry readings, public education, and of course, the publication of their magazine, Common Ground. As I contend in my larger dissertation chapter, his participation in the CCAU may account for some of his artistic choices in the John Henry series, including his emphasis on Appalachia as a multiracial space. Given that little visual language existed in which to imagine a true multiracial democracy, Hayden's series can be understood as an attempt to use the existing language of Appalachian folklore to create that representation. Among his circle of friends within the CCAU were two artists who were similarly using the language of, quotes, outsider narratives to advocate for multiracial democracy and articulate critiques of Jim Crow. As yet, we know comparatively little about Hayden's friendship with the poet Langston Hughes. However, it appears that he first met the poet in 1940 at an art exhibition where Hayden was exhibiting his painting Where Tricky Sam Shot Father Lamb. The pair exchanged ideas about the significance of African American folklore, and as archival records from the Yale Beinecke Library indicate, it appears that they continued that correspondence until Hughes' death. I first noticed this connection after locating a funeral brochure for Langston Hughes kept with Hayden's most treasured papers in the Hayden Family Art Trust. Both were active participants in CCAU art shows and monthly meetings, and as I show in my dissertation, they both explored similar themes related to African American folk life throughout the 1940s. In parallel, Hayden also cultivated a friendship with the Japanese-American artist Mine Okubo, seen at the top left. After seeing a CCAU exhibition of her drawings about her life in a Japanese-American concentration camp. His diaries indicate that they continued corresponding throughout 1945, and that both he and his wife, Mimi, ardently supported Asian-American anti-Jim Crow activism, a topic which I continue to research. Taken together, in the context of Hayden's activism and travels, the series was the product of the artist's advocacy for multiracial democracy and for the uplift of Appalachian workers whose struggles and triumphs had yet to be recognized. Hayden would continue to advocate for the placement of the series in public spaces where viewers of all ages could encounter the story of John Henry. In the late 1960s, the Haydens sought to place the John Henry series at the Smithsonian Art Museum, where it had been on exhibition. The museum declined, requesting that Hayden locate a donor who could gift this series to the museum instead. This was not to be. Instead, the Haydens moved forward with plans to show the series at Fisk University and a newly opened Appalachian Cultural Center. To that end, it feels most appropriate that my presentation today has taken place here at the Appalachian Studies Association. My presentation today is dedicated to the curator of the John Henry Series show at Fisk University, Dr. David Driscoll, who passed away in 2020 from COVID-19. Above all things, he believed that Black life and Black artists matter. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Anne. I hope that you jump over to the chat. There's a lot of activity in the chat, and I really believe that if we were in person after this session, there'd be a large group going to have a cup of coffee together. So we do have time. If anybody would like to ask an oral question, we have time to take one or two of those. You can just raise your hand. Okay, well, we'll move on, and I'm really excited to see the chatter in the chat. It's awesome. So we're going to move on to Elizabeth James, and I could pronounce your last name without practicing. So Elizabeth, you want to put your slides up so we can see that everything looks okay? Probably should have done this before we got started this morning.
No problem.
That's
Just getting them
me.
up now. Yes.
There you are. There you are. Perfect. Looks good. Okay, you can get started. Just self-introduce and then get started.
Fantastic. So my name is Elizabeth James, and I'm an archivist here at Marshall University. I work on primarily manuscript materials, so everything not created by Marshall and created by members of the Huntington, West Virginia, and broader Appalachian community. So today, I'm going to talk about using metadata describing Appalachian materials as data for reparative archival redescription projects. And I'm going to talk about what all of those words mean, because I know that sometimes that can be a little obscure for non-librarians and archivists. But first I want to say that I'm speaking from Huntington, West Virginia on lands varyingly held by the Adena, Hopewell, Shawnee, and Eastern Cherokee peoples. Since I am presenting on a topic that relates to reparative practices to address racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic disparities in description of library and archival materials, I'd like to provide some additional context on my background to be more fully transparent about where exactly I am speaking from. I am a white individual who is from Central Alabama and has lived in Appalachia, specifically West Virginia, for the past 6 years. I'm the first person in my family to pursue higher education. I attended college in New England, where I was made very aware of the stereotypes held by various regions in the United States against other regions. I say this with an acknowledgement that, much like our archival and library collections, there are gaps within my experience and the perspective that I bring as a result of systemic and implicit biases. My presentation aims to discuss how bias can creep into the ways that we access information that is considered scholarly and that frames our research, and how that bias can be remediated through reparative descriptive actions on the metadata that describes those resources. So, what is metadata? Metadata is a word that recursively describes the phenomenon of data used to describe data. Metadata might include the title or author of a book or a pamphlet. For digital documents, it can include authors that contributed comments, date a document was edited, and more. One familiar place where you may have encountered metadata, and what we'll talk about today, is when searching library catalogs and archival finding aids, or even descriptions of digitized materials. Essentially, metadata is the information that describes these resources so that you can find them and use them in your scholarship in the first place. While websites and other digital platforms can contain metadata, I'm going to focus specifically on cultural heritage and academic uses of metadata. So where does it come from? We know that metadata describes the resources that we use in our everyday work and research, but it has to come from somewhere. Who decides what metadata is important? Are there specifications for how materials have to be described? Like any social phenomenon or practice, the answers to these questions are guided by individual, professional, and societal values, biases, and customs. For instance, metadata and standards that outline how metadata should be used come from organizations that are charged with creating and maintaining metadata standards, such as the Library of Congress. Organizations charged with creating and maintaining controlled vocabularies, again, Library of Congress, the Getty, other similar institutions. Librarians and archivists who describe the materials using the standards and vocabularies. In addition, metadata can also be automatically generated now that we live in a very digital world. So a date something was last edited, or who contributed to a document. All of that now counts as metadata that's automatically created in many instances. All of the information that we use to find materials for research has the type and content of information that we see guided by unacknowledged national standards and local, institutional, or individual practices. The magnitude to which this can impact scholars, students, and community members alike is profound. Metadata that is inclusive can be the difference between whether a student feels like a resource is for them and their level of comfort researching a topic or excluding that topic entirely. So don't worry about all of this lovely stuff. I'm going to give just a tiny brief overview. So to give you a more visual representation of places where bias can creep into the cycle of information creation, acquisition, description, use, and sharing, I'd like to share a model that is still in progress that I'm working on that tries to more fully describe areas in which archives and libraries need to do better with regard to collecting and adequately stewarding Appalachian materials, with particular attention to underrepresented narratives as a result of systemic exclusion. So some of the areas where bias can creep in is when an item is created. Each creator exists in a society that will impact the nature of the item, and all creators have a perspective that will impact the materials they create and whether those materials survive at all or whether they're considered important to offer to libraries or archives. The item is then considered for addition to library or archive. Some institutions have other models in which they can actively acquire materials. At Marshall, we rely exclusively on donations and working with the community to determine what is important for them to document and what they would like for us to steward. So in that instance, there is a very individualized type of bias that can come in. So the curator, librarian, or archivist determines whether an item should be added to an institution. This could vary according to local policy or personal biases that are informed by institutional, professional, or societal values. Materials accepted past this test and items that are not will ultimately be less represented in the archival narrative. So then the institution has to describe these items and make it accessible so that you, the user, whether it's a student, scholar, or community member, can actually use these materials. When and to what depth a material or an item is described can also be impacted by those same institutional, professional, and societal values based on perceived importance or subjective scholarly value. And they may be described in varying levels of details and with varying quality of description based on institutional priorities, resources, and available employee skill sets. Items could be described using frameworks and terminologies that may be implicitly biased, which is what we're going to talk about today. Then items are used by individuals, which people exist in a society that will impact how they use and understand the item. And individuals may underuse items that are improperly described or underdescribed because they are more difficult to locate. Then the full item may be available online and described again by the institution at that point, where it goes through the same kind of process where it might get more or less detailed description, more or less nuanced description based on whoever happens to be looking at the item. There are other models for archival collecting, but this is one of the big ones because there are post-custodial models in which items might be scanned but remain with the communities in which created them, but this is one of the primary ones. Time is inherent in each of these steps. They're not subsequent in that each step occurs relatively shortly after the other. Description and processing might occur decades after the collection is donated, which might occur decades after the collection is created. So for the full item is available online, I'd also like to note that making something available digitally increases the possibility that it can provide harm with how it's described. So you can perpetuate harmful narratives. So I'll give you a few examples of what this looks like for Appalachian studies specifically. So what I have right here is a screenshot of a Library of Congress subject heading. This is the accepted subject heading for books that or other materials that are written about Appalachian people. I want you to take a look at the variant section. So the variant section, when you're looking at Library of Congress subject headings, are other terms that people might use to locate the accepted term, which is Appalachians parentheses people. Those variants include Appalachian people and mountain whites. And if you look down a little bit further, the earlier established version of Appalachians people was mountain whites, which obviously inherently excludes individuals with other identities. So that legacy is baked into this term that is used, and it's the only term that is just a single one that refers to Appalachian peoples. So there's an entirely separate subject heading. Often the preferred term is Appalachian now, but that doesn't exist in the Library of Congress subject headings and cannot be used as a result. So if you are Black in Appalachia, you have to go with African Americans, Appalachian region. You do not get your own term. You have to have one that is constructed. And that's bias that is at the national level. So then you also can have institutional bias through lack of expertise and cultural competency. For instance, if someone is cataloging a book, this is a standard catalog record describing a book and is a great example of the implications when non-subject experts describe materials. Catalogers are trained in describing books, and they're not always experts in the material that they're describing, and the description can sometimes be less nuanced as a result. This catalog record, which is titled, or for a book titled The Social Reality of a Group of Rural Low Status Appalachian Women, a Grounded Theory Study, implicitly makes judgments about the individuals under study. And the subject headings used, rural women, poor women, in Tennessee, specifically Cocke County, uses a shorthand that is reductionist for these lived experiences of individuals. And similarly, the contents are just chapter titles that are used sort of as a shorthand for this person maybe didn't have time to actually dig into the book to determine what it's about and how to describe it in a way that acknowledges these experiences. Similarly, the summary is extracted from the book itself, which is entirely unclear to the viewer. It also implicitly makes judgments such as these findings should be of interest to social workers dealing with low status people. This means that it's hard for a user to tell what information is coming from the original book, which obviously has its own societal influences from the time in which it was published and researched, and what is coming from the cataloger, which is an institutional position of power. And then with archival collections, you can have a similar issue where through resource scarcity, there can be just a dearth of information that results in an oversimplification of a collection. For instance, this is an extract of a finding aid that was completed by a work study student 5 years ago, which means that someone without any kind of archive subject expertise described this collection which happens to be a small collection of materials related to sociology and anthropology in Appalachia. So as you can tell by the scant description, not much attention to detail was provided for this collection. A direct result of this lack of detail is that this collection has not been used in the past 2 years that I have been at Marshall, and the minimal description can contribute to an oversimplification of the Appalachian narrative that is then shared and perpetuated more widely. So in summary, we need to do better. There are decades of imprecise, inadequate, and harmful description to not only fix, but acknowledge the harm that was done and document that. We must find a way to address these issues ethically and at scale. While it took decades to create these records, taking decades is not an acceptable timetable for fixing them. Our community of users deserve better than a simple find and replace approach. They deserve an approach that is conscientious and thoughtful and acknowledges the harm caused. So, how do we get there? When we're dealing with collections in mass amounts that were collected over decades, we have to figure out what materials are minimally described and pertain to historically marginalized groups that are already extant in our collections, using a combination of manual and automated techniques. For instance, if I were looking at digitized photographs, I would perhaps look for descriptions that are particularly short, or I could look for key terms that contain outdated terminology that is no longer acceptable. I would then audit that metadata describing the materials. So to do this in a way that does not perpetuate the harm that has been caused, librarians and archivists have to possess a bias-aware and social justice-focused mindset that involves connecting with communities to determine their own priorities. Automated methods for identification that are mixed with manual and automated editing approaches will allow librarians and archivists to make the field of Appalachian studies more accessible and inclusive. A sample workflow for this whole process might look like using automated techniques to identify existing records or finding aids with short descriptions, or might entail doing topic modeling and subject analysis of these records and finding aids as a text corpus using Python. It could also include targeting low use collections to determine if they're low use because they are under-described, or if they're described in ways that don't actually match the needs of communities and scholars doing research with these materials. For instance, if an individual wants to search for materials related to Appalachian communities, and you have it described as African American, it's not going to inherently pop up when someone does a keyword search. So this summer, to convert some of this sort of theory into practice, I will work with 10,000 digitized photographs and 600 finding aids describing archival collections at Marshall to conduct an audit into Marshall's legacy descriptive practices at a larger scale. By examining those collections and how they are described, we'll be able to examine the archival silences in our collections and address them by identifying and building relationships with communities whose histories have been underdocumented, prioritizing collecting, processing, and describing these collections in line with community wants and needs, and prioritizing the digitization, sensitive description, and sharing of those materials. Again, all of these actions will be guided by community interests and needs. Communities have a right to determine what materials go to an archive and what should be accessible and what should remain in the community. Archives have justifiably lost the trust of many of the communities that have been previously underdocumented, whose materials would have fallen within their collecting scopes, but because of bias and other issues, were just entirely forgotten. And I will work to document this project to make it shareable and usable by institutions with varying level of resources, whether it's a local historical society that relies on volunteers or a larger university archive. It's critical that institutions have access to this work to make the field of Appalachian studies and the use of resources describing Appalachian people and subjects more approachable. in archives, this work is often incredibly slow. So I recognize that any change or action that I take right now will often be in place for 20 to 30 years. And that is a huge responsibility to myself and the people whose histories I describe and steward. So I would love to hear from everyone about how you have found your research impacted by some of the materials available and what you weren't able to find, whether it's because of inadequate description or deprioritization of materials that you might be interested in. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Boy, I feel so privileged to have participated in this session. When I woke up this morning and was getting ready for the day, I had no idea that I was going to hear from three brilliant young scholars in Appalachian studies, and it's just been a phenomenal session. We do have some time, and there is chatter in the chat, so please, all the speakers, please, and our speakers are engaging. So there's specifically a question about a slide, to borrow a slide from you, Elizabeth. Anybody in the audience want to make a comment or ask a question, all you need to do is hit the hand raise button if you'd like to do it orally, or we can just continue in the chat, because that stays open even after the session closes. Alana.
Hi, can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
Hey, it's Elena.
Elena, I'm sorry.
That's okay. No, every day of my life, right?
I bet, yeah.
This is a comment more than a question. I'll go ahead and get that stereotypical statement right out of the way. One thing that I mentioned in the chat earlier that my dissertation, we have a date for proposal defense, woohoo, is discourse analysis. And so this is incredibly important to me as I tried to see the ways that print media has impacted identity formation. And not only is our region not all white, it's also not all cisgendered heterosexual, and trying to find information about queer people, LGBTQ people is, I think if you're queer, you are very aware of all the different terms that have been used to describe us over time. And I hope that in the future, it will be much in the same way that we need Appalachian as a search term. Also because African American doesn't cover every Black person. Queer people have been here forever, and I can't, it's look up the F word, look up gay, but not really gay, because gay didn't come into the lexicon as we understand it now, 100 years ago. So I hope that, I don't know what the end of my sentence there is going to be. I guess I just want to thumbs up that somebody is paying attention to this, because it makes it really difficult to find not just what I need, but where are we in this? We're there, but it's this blank space where our faces and bodies and work are supposed to be.
That's a really important comment, and I'm really glad that you expressed it. Do any of the panel or any of the speakers have a reaction they'd like to share?
Yes, this is Elizabeth. That's exactly what I'm hoping to address, is identifying areas where previously we have materials or don't have materials at all, and seeking to make it so that people can see themselves in their archives and see themselves as part of Appalachian history and present.
Thank you for that, Elizabeth. Anybody else have something they'd like to share orally? Okay, well, I really appreciate everyone participating this morning. The next sessions start at 10:30. Also want to encourage you to take a look at the poster presentations that are available 24/7, the exhibit hall, and our advertisers that are all on the webpage. And tonight there is a screening of the Corbin expulsion that's sponsored by several organizations. It starts at 7 o'clock, and it documents the important race riots of 1919. So grab yourself some popcorn and maybe an adult beverage and join us tonight for this special event at 7 o'clock. Enjoy the rest of the conference, and hopefully we'll see you in a couple of sessions moving forward.
Thank you so much for your work, Michelle.
Oh, you're welcome. I had an easy job.
Yes, thank you, Michelle.
You're welcome.